بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. There's a narration collected by Imam Al-Hafidh Al-Nasa'i rahimahullah ta'ala, and versions and wordings of this same narration have been collected by Ibn Abi Hatim in his tafsir and other books of hadith and tafsir. And this narration was collected on the authority of Abdullah ibn Abbas and Sa'id ibn Jubayr and Abu Sa'id al-Khudri radiyallahu anhum. They all narrate to us that the last verse of the Quran to be revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the verse وَاتَّقُوا يَوْمًا تُرْجَعُونَ فِيهِ إِلَى اللَّهِ ثُمَّ تُوَفَّى كُلُّ نَفْسٍ مَا كَسَبَتْ وَهُمْ لَا يُظْلَمُونَ. This is verse number 281 of Surah Al-Baqarah, the second chapter of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in this verse, that which translates to, and fear and work righteousness, and fear a day in which you will all be returned to your Lord. You will all be returned to Allah. And then each individual and each soul shall be recompensed fully for what it used to do. So this verse, as Abu Sa'id al-Khudri says, radiyallahu anhu, that this verse was revealed 9 nights, 9 days before the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away. Now, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's illness that he passed away from was a little over 2 weeks long. And that this illness was actually a result of some poison that he had ingested after the conquest of Khaybar. In the conquest of Khaybar, a Jewish woman, or as the narration says, Jewess, came with a roasted lamb's shoulder, which was the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam favorite cut from the lamb. She knew this. And she roasted it and she poisoned it. And she brought it for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to eat as a gift, just as he had finished the conquest of Khaybar. He sat down with a few of his companions and they began to eat. And 3 of the companions three of the companions had passed away. They were martyred because of the poison that they ingested from this meal. But the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam put a mouthful into his mouth, and Jibreel alayhi salam descended immediately, told him to spit it out. He did so. But then he mentioned near the end of his life, alayhi salatu wassalam, when he first started becoming sick, years later, which is a miracle in itself, that this here is the work that this poison has done in my body since then. And so he was ill for a couple of weeks, a little bit over that. And he said many things during that time. He gave many pieces of advice. But the final verse that was revealed to him 9 nights before he passed away was this verse here in Surah Al-Baqarah. وَاتَّقُوا يَوْمًا تُرْجَعُونَ فِيهِ إِلَى اللَّهِ. And fear a day and work righteousness to protect yourselves from the wrath of a day in which you shall all be returned to Allah. ثُمَّ تُوَفَّى كُلُّ نَفْسٍ مَا كَسَبَتْ وَهُمْ لَا يُظْلَمُونَ. And then each individual, each soul shall be recompensed fully and justly for what you used to do, and none will be oppressed on that day. Now, what's interesting about this verse is that if we really look at it from a bird's eye view, we see that the first verse revealed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq." Recite. Recite in the name of your Lord who has created all of creation. خَلَقَ الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ عَلَقٍ. He created the human being from a clot. And then, after this 5 first verses of Surah Iqra that were revealed, خَلَقَ الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ عَلَقٍ اقرأ وربك الأكرم. Recite, and your Lord is the most generous. علم بالقلم. He taught by the pen. علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. He taught the human being what he did not know previously. So these first 5 verses are discussing the generosity of Allah, the lordship of Allah, and the teaching and knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then we fast forward through all the years and all the trials, all the tribulations, and we arrive at the last and final verse of the Quran. And that last and final verse tells us, and work righteousness and fear a day to protect yourselves from the wrath of a day in which you shall be returned to Allah. We understand from this that the person learns, then he is held responsible for what he has been taught by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that none of that knowledge is of any consequence unless this person puts it into action. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in this verse in no uncertain terms that we are to be afraid. Be afraid. Fear a day. He says, ittaqu yawman. Fear a day and work righteousness to protect yourselves and shield yourselves from the wrath and punishment of a day in which you shall be returned to Allah. And in telling us this, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam later commented on this meaning. In Sahih al-Imam Muslim, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said 3 days before he passed away. He said, لا يموتن أحدكم إلا وهو يحسن الظن بالله عز وجل. 3 days before his death, he said to the companions, none of you is to die until he is making a just and good estimate of Allah, thinking good thoughts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But oftentimes this issue of a dhann billah, making an estimate of Allah, what your impressions of Allah are, whether they are positive or negative, this is grossly misunderstood by many people. In Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, Abdullah ibn Umar narrates that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that Allah himself said, أَنَا عِنْدَ ظَنِّ عَبْدِي بِي. I am with the estimate of my servant of me. If he thinks good of me, then for him is good. If he thinks negatively of me, then for him is bad. But really, what does it mean for a person to think good thoughts? What is husn al-dhann? Thinking good and positive and optimistic thoughts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some people misunderstand this to mean that no matter what you do, no matter how bad you are, always be sure that Allah is going to forgive you. And that is not true. There are people, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us all, every one of us. There are people who are not going to be forgiven by Allah. There are people who are going to beg Allah and they're still going to be put into hell. There are people who perhaps did more than many of us, and they will still enter the hellfire. It's to the discretion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, he has sent down a book to us, and that is his mithaq. That is his agreement, his contract between himself and his servants, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises in that book, فَلَنْ يُخْلِفَ اللَّهُ وَعْدَهُ. Allah will never prove treacherous in his promise, will never break his promise, subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what does it mean to think good thoughts and be optimistic and have optimistic thoughts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? This is really put into a context when we look at how Allah speaks about those whom He is already pleased with. We don't know who of us is going to be forgiven. We don't know who of us is going to be punished, held to account. We don't know. I couldn't tell you about myself before anybody else. The discretion is for Allah and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, we do know the outcome of those whom Allah has mentioned in the Quran. We know the outcome of Pharaoh. We know the outcome of Qarun. We know the outcome of Haman. We know the outcome of Abu Lahab. We know the outcome of Abu Jahl. These people are mentioned in the Quran. We know the outcome of the people of Ad and Thamud and Madian and the people of Lut and the people of Babylon, the people of Ibrahim, the people of Nuh. And so we can be certain that whoever has those descriptions, then that person will have a similar outcome. We also know the outcome of Ayub and Yaqub and Yusuf and even the brothers of Yusuf, alayhimus salatu wassalam. We know the story of Maryam and Luqman and the story of Nuh and Ibrahim. And we can say with great certainty that whoever has those descriptions is going to be forgiven by Allah. But how do we balance that? We want to put that into action. How do I balance what I think of Allah? How can I be sure that I am worshiping Allah, the one who sent down the Quran, and not worshiping something that my imagination has conjured up? Because that is a real issue. People decide that Allah is whatever they want Him to be without learning what Allah has told us about Himself, and they then proceed to negotiate with a figment of their imagination. Rather, there's a narration in Muwatta Malik which really captures exactly what a person is to feel to make him eligible for the forgiveness of Allah. The definition really of thinking good thoughts and making a correct and just estimate of Allah. Being optimistic with our view towards Allah. There was a man, Anas ibn Malik narrates that there was a man from the Ansar. He fell ill. This narration is collected by Abu Dawood and also Imam Malik in his Muwatta. This man fell ill, and it seemed that he was on his deathbed. And so the Prophet ﷺ went to visit him. And he asked him, كيف أنت يا فلان? How are you feeling? And so the man responded and said, بخير يا رسول الله. أرجو الله وأخاف ذنوبي. He said, I'm doing well. Honestly, I am very hopeful in the forgiveness of Allah, yet I am very terrified of the repercussions of my sin. Notice what he said. I'm hopeful in the forgiveness of Allah. I am terrified by the repercussions of my sin. The Prophet ﷺ said, لا يجتمعان في قلب عبد مسلم في مثل هذا الموطن إلا آتاه الله ما يرجو وأمنه مما يخاف. He said these two emotions, hope in Allah's overwhelming forgiveness, fear of one's sin and repercussions, these two feelings, these two emotions do not unite in the heart of any Muslim in this circumstance, except that Allah will give him what he is hoping for and protect him from what he fears. And so a person is to make just, correct thoughts of Allah. How do we do that? We learn what to think of Allah from the Quran. We fear Allah's punishment because of His justice. We hope for Allah's forgiveness even if we don't deserve it. And if we really fear Allah, then we refrain from prohibitions. We refrain from haram. And if we really hope in Allah, then we seek it by doing good deeds. But if a person doesn't do good deeds, a person doesn't refrain from haram and says, well, I know that Allah is going to forgive me, Allah Ghafur Rahim, doesn't do anything to achieve that, then this person is being disingenuous with this claim. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He make us of those whom are forgiven on the Day of Judgment, that He unite us and gather us in the ranks of the prophets and messengers and the righteous on the Day of Judgment. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Jazakumullahu khairan.